Okay, we're live.
Okay, good evening and welcome to the March 2024 Special Hybrid Planning Commission meeting. I'm Mike Murphy, the chair. Tonight's Hybrid Planning Commission meeting is being brought to you by Zoom. Welcome to all and thank you for joining us tonight. Commissioners, please have your microphones turned on for the roll call. Allison, can you please do the roll call?
All right, Commissioner Accuse.
Here.
Commissioner Batazzo.
Here.
Commissioner Boatsman.
Here.
Commissioner Gels.
Here.
Commissioner Rashis is not here. And Vice Chair Ragab is also not here yet. And Chair Murphy.
Here.
All right, thank you.
Okay. It appears that we have a quorum. So for this meeting, we continue to utilize the Zoom platform. I will do my best to recognize you in order in which hands are raised. After being recognized, you may then ask questions, make comments, etc. Our first item of business is public appearances. This is the opportunity for anyone to speak to the commission about issues of concern. Allison, is there anyone who has signed up for appearances that wishes to address the commission?
No one signed up for tonight.
Okay, that makes that easy. So our first and only item of special business is the Planning Commission Agenda Bill PCB 24-05, Comprehensive Plan Periodic Review, Housing Element Initial Brief. Welcome, Adam Zach. Go ahead, you're the presenter.
I was going to just do a couple quick introductory remarks, and then we'll hand it off to Adam. So just wanted to note that we've got Mayor Neese joining us tonight. He was a member of the housing work group, and he'll be making a few remarks after Adam goes through a short presentation, kind of giving us an overview of the process that led up to developing this draft of the housing element. And Mayor Neese will speak to some of the work that he's been doing with the state legislature and how that ties in with all the requirements for the housing element. And then I think Commissioners Boatsman and Accuse were also members of the work group. They may have some remarks to make as well, just on kind of their thoughts on the process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam. He's going to do this short presentation. We'll hear from the work group members, and then we'll dive into more of a detailed overview of the actual draft. All right,
Great.
thanks.
Allison, may get my screen shared here. Let's see. All right, so as Allison mentioned, tonight we'll be taking a look at the housing work group draft of the housing element of the comprehensive plan. This is the element that we've been eagerly awaiting through this process. We've talked about it a few times at previous meetings, and so we're now to the point of review. Are looking at the presentation tonight, I'll give you some background on how we got to where we're at today, and then also a quick summary of the housing element requirements, the things that are set in state law, regional policy, and countywide policies. And then go over the remaining process and where we're going with this in the future. And then, as Allison mentioned, we'll have some comments from the mayor and from the other work group members if they'd like. And then after that, I'll walk you through, I'll give you a quick kind of flyby on the element so that you're prepared to provide your written comments on the draft. So to take a look at the project history, we've been as you all know, the comprehensive plan periodic review has been underway for quite some time. This housing project really started in the spring of 2022 when we set the comprehensive plan update scope of work. That scope of work created a housing work group to prepare draft amendments to the housing element. This was one of the elements of the comprehensive plan that we knew going into this update was going to require some more in-depth amendments as opposed to Some of the other elements that we've looked at that have had these kind of more surgical targeted updates, this is really, we knew the housing element was going to need a little bit more of an overhaul. So we created that housing work group, which was composed of 3 city council members and 2 planning commissioners, to prepare this initial draft to bring before you, with the intent of kind of getting a vetted draft before you that's gone through some review ahead of time. So we started, the housing work group met a few times in the summer of 2022. But then as Commerce and the county started taking actions related to House Bill 1220, which we'll talk about quite a bit tonight, and it became clear that the housing work was going to expand beyond what we had initially scoped. And so we paused the housing work group in November of 2022 to allow the Department of Commerce to kind of get their guidance together and put it out there what they were going to expect of us. And then also the King County needed to make some amendments to the countywide planning policies, specifically to set this growth target by income bracket, which we'll take a look at in a bit here. That was the main thing that King County needed to finish before we could really get started on the housing element. And so all of that kind of came together in the latter part of 2023. The final Commerce guidance for some of this work was issued in August of 2023, so 5 months ago. And the King County updated its countywide planning policies to set the housing targets by income range or affordability range. They set that in the countywide planning policies in August as well. And so from there, we had these 2 kind of larger reports that needed to be completed based on the Commerce guidance and related to this House Bill 1220, which changed a lot of the statewide requirements. And so from August to December, staff prepared those reports and provided those to the City Council in January of this year. Those reports, the LCA supplement and the RDI, the racially disparate impacts evaluation, those 2 reports looked at how much land capacity we have for these housing targets, and then also completed a requirement from House Bill 1220 that the city evaluate its housing policies for potential racially disparate impacts, and then adopt policies during this periodic review to begin to undo those impacts that we may have identified. So that led to some of the policies that we'll see in the draft housing element here later tonight. So in January, the City Council was briefed on those reports, which were provided with Agenda Bill 6385. So if you're looking for those reports, you can find them with that agenda bill. One of the things that came out of that with the land capacity analysis supplement was that there was some additional capacity that we needed to add for multifamily and mixed use housing. And so when we presented to the City Council, we asked them for their direction on the preferred approach to addressing that small capacity shortfall. The council provided that on January 16th. They provided that direction to the housing work group. And then with that in hand, we were able to then resume working with the housing work group to start preparing this draft. And so from the end of January until last Thursday, the housing work group was meeting, they met 5 times total to prepare this draft housing element and kind of put everything together that we'll be taking a look at over the next couple of meetings. So that gets us up to very much current day here. As I mentioned, the housing work group was a joint subcommittee of Planning Commission and City Council members. There were 5 members total. This was something that was created. The housing work group was created in that scope of work to do this work here that we'll be looking at. The members of the group were Wendy Weicker, Craig Reynolds, and Salim Neese. And then from the Planning Commission, Kate Hughes and Carolyn Boatsman. So they were the ones that we were working on this draft for the last month and a half here. As you look at the Planning Commission Bill 2405, Exhibit 1 is the Housing Work Group's draft housing element. So that's the document that came out of the work group that was prepared over the course of those 5 meetings. And what we really did as we were working through this with the work group, the work group really focused on crafting those policy amendments or new policies to satisfy the minimum requirements that are set in the state law, the regional policy, and then the countywide planning policies. As we'll see as we get into it here, the housing element has some of the most complex requirements of any element under the Growth Management Act. And those requirements were recently updated in 2021 with that House Bill 1220, which required some new things that we didn't have in the housing element previously. So because the housing work group really focused on satisfying those requirements, throughout the draft, you'll see that the intent of each of these policies is really to meet, at the very least, meet the minimum necessary for each of those requirements. In some of the places we exceeded those, the minimum, but we wanted to make sure that this draft was really crafted so that it satisfied all of those state requirements. And then as we got close to the end there, or by the time we got to the end, the housing work group last Thursday unanimously voted to recommend this draft to the Planning Commission. So we spent quite a bit of time kind of refining and honing this draft. There was kind of 4 major steps that we used with the housing work group. So the first step in the process was a briefing on those reports, that land capacity analysis supplement and the racially disparate impacts evaluation. And then we also provided a briefing, staff provided a briefing on the GMA, the Growth Management Act requirements and the things that had changed with House Bill 1220 and other countywide planning policies. And then also a briefing on the city council direction, where we were going with the rest of this housing work that we had ahead of us. Then the second step was a survey that we administered to the housing work group members to identify their preferred approaches to satisfying all of these requirements that we had gone over. And so the purpose of that survey was to for a lot of these requirements, there's some gray area in how you can satisfy those requirements. And so with the survey, we asked the group to identify their preferred approaches to kind of filling in that gray area and completing those, or not completing, satisfying those requirements. So that survey really helped us find a consensus on some of these kind of thornier issues that the policies address. Then at step 3, the work group reviewed a preliminary draft that staff prepared based on that survey that the housing work group completed, and considering those minimum requirements. And so the work group kind of worked through that preliminary draft and refined those goals and policies and the text of the introduction to ensure, again, that it kind of fit with those and aligned with those preferred policy approaches, and that they also were satisfying those minimum requirements. And then finally, after we had gone through that review, there was 2 meetings of refining those drafts and making sure that we did a little bit of wordsmithing with the group to arrive at the recommendation that's before you today. It's the housing work group process kind of summarized there. Now you'll also see Exhibit 3 of the Planning Commission bill is this housing planning framework. And this is really where you can find, we wanted to provide you, the Planning Commission, with information about those requirements for the housing element. Because this is one of the more complicated elements in terms of what the GMA requires, and then particularly at the county level, there's another kind of layer on top of that that doesn't apply to, say, like the utilities element or capital facilities element. So a little more complicated. And that was, again, Exhibit 3. You can see a summary of those state, regional, and countywide requirements. And this will also, you'll see a notation in the draft that ties back to that housing planning framework. So throughout the current draft, you'll see after some brackets, or after a policy, you'll see some text in brackets. And what that is doing is it's pointing back to that housing planning framework and saying that this policy is directed at this minimum requirement. So for example, I put policy 1.5 because it was nice and short here. Policy 1.5 says take actions to promote healthy and safe homes. And that's directed back at countywide planning policy requirement 18. So you'll see that in that Exhibit 3, which I don't know the exact text off the top of my head. I should have pulled that, but it was something about healthy and safe homes as well. So it's really like linked between that CPP requirement and the policy in the draft. So you can, if you're curious where something came from in the draft, there's probably a citation of there should be a notation of where that requirement can be found in Exhibit 3. The other piece of this that we'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks is a land use element consistency amendments. So these are changes to land use policies that are necessary to square the land use element with the changes that we've now made in the housing element. And these are, so because we are adopting new policies in the housing element that relate to housing, we needed to update some of the policies in the land use element. In addition to those consistency amendments, there were also some policies that were highlighted in the racially disparate impacts evaluation that we needed to review those policies as part of this process to satisfy that requirement as well. So we did the consistency review and reviewed those policies that were highlighted by the RDI evaluation. And that's where these land use element amendments came from. To simplify the notation of the changes, the strikeout and underline that you see in Exhibit 2 in the land use element consistency amendments, those are showing the changes from the last Planning Commission draft of the land use element. So anything that's proposed to be struck or anything new would be a change from the Planning Commission's draft, not the currently adopted draft. And we just did that so that there wasn't, otherwise there would be a lot of strikeout and underline. It'd be really hard to track where the changes started. So these are changes additive to that previous work that the Planning Commission did. And just like with the housing element, these land use element consistency amendments were also reviewed by the housing work group and recommended as part of the package of changes. And the other thing is we categorized the different changes to the land use element to make it a little bit easier to see where substantive changes were proposed. So you'll see in the draft, there will be some green highlighting the goals and policies that are highlighted in green. Those are substantive changes. So these are more significant changes. The goal and policies highlighted in blue are the implementation policies. And this is a set of amendments that's proposed to basically just make the land use element have the same implementation policies that we have in the housing element, because those are just kind of general about implementation. It makes it a little bit, both drafts a little better, to have those amendments made under goal 29. And then finally, the yellow highlighted goals and policies are the minor consistency amendments. These are things where the policy direction hasn't necessarily changed, but the wording is just more consistent with the changes that we've made in the housing element. So as you go through the looking at Exhibit 2, those green highlights are probably where you want to spend your most time reviewing, because that's where the most significant changes are proposed. So at that point, I would field any questions. As I mentioned, I'm planning on walking you through the draft after the housing work group folks have had their chance to provide some additional comments. So we will take a look at the draft, but I'll turn it over to any questions at this point. Great. So I think at this point, if the mayor's still with us, Mayor Neese, I think, and take it away. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Commissioners, Chair, to be here. I appreciate, of course, Commissioner Boatsman and Acuse, your work on the housing work group. It was great to have that opportunity to work through some of the stuff that you're going to be digging into the joint group. I wanted to, and for the record, Salim Neese, Mayor of Mercer Island, and also GMPC member. I wanted to talk a little bit about the framework of what happened upstream of all the processes that Adam went through. When House Bill 1220 was passed by the legislature back in 2021, it kicked off a number of bureaucratic processes that had to occur to get us to the point that we're at today. The first thing that had to happen is that Office of Financial Management, the OFM, had to come up with projections of how many homes the state of Washington needed over the next 20 years. They also create an estimate of how many jobs the state is expected to create over that 20-year horizon. And then they take those numbers and pass them down to jurisdictions at the county level to divvy up between the cities. And the GMPC, the Growth Management Planning Council, which is advisory to the King County Council, is the body that's responsible for divvying up those targets amongst the, I think, 39 cities that are in King County, or 39 cities and jurisdictions that get an allocation. And here to now, with the Growth Management Act, we've only allocated housing and jobs. And housing has always been measured in units, and a single family house measured the same as a studio apartment. They were all treated as one unit. And House Bill 1220 came along and said that Washington also has a need for affordable housing at different area median income bands, and that jurisdictions need to plan for and accommodate those targets as well. And this becomes a target in addition or supplementing your housing target. Mercer Island had delivered over from 2006 until the beginning of this planning cycle about 1,100 housing units. And most of those would have been market rate housing units, a good number of single family homes, multifamily units in town center, outside of town center, and the multifamily zones. And then ADUs also count as a middle housing component. So House Bill 1220 comes along and OFM says, over the next 20 years, Washington State needs 1 million new homes, and half those homes need to be affordable at 50% AMI and below. So 500,000 of Washington's new homes are going to be severely income restricted. And then another good portion are going to be 50 to 80% AMI. And so when you get into the materials that you'll be looking at tonight, you're going to see some pretty gobsmacking numbers for affordable housing targets in Mercer Island. And I wanted to give a little bit of context of how we got to that place. So in King County, when OFM gave us that target, the GMPC stood up a committee called the Affordable Housing Committee. And the AHC was made up of many electeds and something called the Partners Table. And this was kind of an equity table of tribal members, diverse community members, stakeholders, and they rotated people through this mechanism to advise the AHC. And ultimately, the AHC had three options that they came up with and they brought to the GMPC. And it was, should we take King County's share of affordable housing and just divide it up pro rata by population among the cities? So everybody gets a certain percent of 30% AMI, 50% AMI, 80% AMI, and market rate housing. Or should we look countywide at what is out there? What's our inventory of affordable housing? Who's created any? Who's created none? Who's created some? And then should we just wait it so that it reaches equilibrium at 20 years? Or should we look at the balance of their housing target? So how many units does Mercer Island have left to build in its allocation? And then allocate up to that. And ultimately, after a lot of debate, that was the mechanism that they built. And so what you're going to see is that Mercer Island in a regular planning cycle would have had a requirement to build 1,239 housing units. And that would have been understood to be any housing units. We've always said all housing is good housing. What happened is Mercer Island received an allocation of almost all affordable housing units. The numbers are of market rate housing, I think, is in like 30 or 40 of the 1,239. So you have almost 1,200 or so affordable housing units, many of those at 50% AMI and below. And what we know with 50% AMI and below is that you need a subsidy to build those units. You can't create enough incentives that a market rate development can produce those at any yield. And you also need density. And so you're going to see in these materials that we had to do some upzoning in the town center, and we're going to have to do some upzoning in the commercial office zone to add multifamily, because you need the medium to higher densities to support the 50% and below AMI units. And so as you work through this, you're going to scratch your head and say, wow, there's a lot of policies in here about creating incentives to have income restricted housing units. And there's really not much talk about market rate housing, single family housing, middle housing. And the reason is that that's not affordable. And our goal is almost 100% affordable housing. And so I know that, you know, there might be an inclination to look at a housing element and say all housing is good housing, but Adam and Jeff have come up with, I guess, a table that illustrates pretty well the barriers to producing the goals that we have. And what became clear in working through all of the things that we had to work through is that focusing on affordable housing needs to be the goal. And if we're not talking about that, we're talking about a very small fraction of our statewide mandate of housing units. And that really shouldn't be the focus, because those units will naturally get created. The other thing to think about is that in our town center, we produce affordable housing units at a rate of 10%. And that's a trade-off for height. So if you go to 5 stories and you build 200 units, 20 of them need to be affordable. And that's in the like 65% AMI range. We need units at 50% AMI, 30% AMI. We need shelter beds. We need permanently supportive units at 30% AMI. And so you can understand you're going to need some really significant incentives to try and produce those. But you will always produce them at a ratio to a market rate housing unit, right? So maybe you could get to 20%, maybe you could get to 30% if you really tried, you know, stacking height and, you know, multifamily tax incentives, different mechanism together, you might get to 30%. And so it's a way to say that what's coming to you is going to be stacked with levers and incentives and tools, but they're all around creating a very high percentage of affordable housing units, because there is such a strong need for affordable housing over the next 20 years. I would add to that the state legislature has been housing crazy for the last 3 sessions, and we've seen all sorts of bills come through. but the one that hasn't got through is a TOD bill, a transit oriented development bill. And we've been pretty firm on all TOD bills having some sort of component tied to the House Bill 1220 jurisdictional targets. So if they're going to upzone a half-mile radius around a train station or a bus rapid transit, it's our expectation that they calibrate that to what they did with House Bill 1220 and the affordability requirements. So I would say keep a strong focus on town center and the fact that even though we're talking about 6 stories now, that could go to a calculation of a floor area ratio that we've seen as high as 7 or 8, which would yield, maybe up to a 15-story building, depending on what the setbacks and some of the daylight planning was. And in that scenario, we would accept nothing less than a 20% affordable housing mandate coming out of a TOD bill. And so as you look at what you might do in town center, you should expect that future legislation out of Olympia would probably be calibrated around 20% to get incentives around height in a TOD type orientation. And that's pretty much all I wanted to share tonight was that context. And if you had any questions about any of that upstream stuff, I'd be happy to answer them. Excellent. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate being invited.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor.
All right. So Commissioners Hughes and Boatsman, I don't know if either of you have something you'd like to say too about the housing work group, but now would be a good time to share.
Yeah, I had some thoughts I wanted to share, Adam. I want to thank the mayor for coming tonight and sharing all that background. I think it's incredibly important to our work to understand that most of what we've done here is mandated. It's not optional. And I also want to thank the planning staff and the mayor and council members Reynolds and Weicker. Councilmember Weicker was the chair of our committee and ran an extremely efficient process. It was hopefully a model for how we can work forward together. Folks were expected to come prepared and get it done, and the staff just really prepared an excellent and concise document for us to look at. So I just want to express my gratitude to the mayor, council members, and staff, and enjoy the document. I'm sure we'll have some fun discussion.
Carolyn, chime in.
Yeah, well, I was very pleased to participate in the housing work group, and the staff and Adam in particular did such a terrific job to provide us with really excellent drafts and informative materials. So much appreciated. And the schedule was very tight, but we always had time to review and comment prior to recommending our referral to the commission. So I think we've met the legislative requirements, as I understand them, and to update our comprehensive plan for the 2024 cycle. There'll be more coming after the end of 2024, but what we have to do in 2024, I think we have met. So I really look forward to hearing the input of the other commissioners, and I will try my best to try to contribute to explaining why the housing work group might have decided on certain language in the case of a certain policy for either the housing or the land use elements. Okay.
Okay. Adam, I think it's back to you.
Yeah, great. Let me share my screen. We'll start with the housing element here, quick walkthrough. So unsurprisingly, starts with an introduction. We tried to keep this introduction really focused through the draft. Again, just really pointing at we tried to keep it all killer, no filler in the introduction here. So it's really directed at the specific requirements for the housing element. And this table 1 is one of the more important pieces of the introduction here. These are the targets that we've been assigned by King County that Mayor Neese referenced for our total housing growth, this first column here, or the second column here. And then each of these subsequent columns to the right are the different housing needs at different income levels that we're required to plan for. And as Mayor Neese pointed out, so these 3 columns here are everything that's more than 80% of the area median income. So these are for households earning near or more than the median income. These would be like our market rate units. And as you can see, these are that's 32 of our 1,239 housing targets. So that works out to about 2% of the total. So that's why, again, much of the focus as we get into the later stages of the element is really going to be on these lower income units, because that's where most of our housing need, as allocated by the county, has fallen. Some of the other things that you'll see here, there's a permanent supportive housing, or PSH. That's part of our less than 30% AMI, our lowest income bracket. And what the permanent supportive housing is that's a housing type where there are services provided on site. So it's not quite like a homeless shelter, but it's extremely low income housing, where maybe there's some other services provided on site. So that's a slightly different thing than like just a regular apartment that has a reduced rent. And so our housing target differentiates between permanent supportive housing and non-permanent supportive housing. The other kind of special housing type is this emergency housing. This target is kind of separate from our other housing targets. And emergency housing is that like shelter space. So whether it's for domestic violence shelter or a homeless shelter, the emergency housing is that like temporary transitional type of housing. So it's slightly different than a normal, like what we would call like a dwelling unit, where it has a kitchen and a bedroom and a bathroom, and it's more it's just a different housing type. So that's this emergency housing need over here. So once in the draft here, once we've articulated what our housing needs are, the next section talks about what capacity we have to accommodate that housing need. This really refers back to that land capacity analysis supplement that we talked about earlier, and some of the actions that we're going to take to address the housing capacity. This paragraph here talks about the upzoning that Mayor Neese referenced, where we'll be looking at, through this process, we'll be looking at adding height to some of town center, and then also adding some multifamily capacity in the commercial office zone, which is that area around the former City Hall building. Most of the work to make those changes to increase that capacity is going to be an implementing code amendment. And that's something that we'll look at once we've finished with the housing element. We'll then take a look at the code amendment, probably in the summer, or well, either way, before we complete the comp plan update, we have to look at that implementing ordinance. So that will be coming as well. From there, after the capacity discussion, there is this section called adequate provisions. And this is, Mayor Neese talked about barriers, looking at some of the barriers and what we need to do to overcome the barriers for housing development, affordable housing development. And that's what this table 2 is really directed at. So it provides some information about the share of existing housing units and whether or not there's a likelihood that a barrier exists. And then talks about the actions that are spelled out in the goals and policies, this final column here. These are the actions that get spelled out in the element that we're going to take to overcome those potential barriers. So as you look at this table here, that's how this kind of connects with some of the other pieces of the element. This is saying that we've identified a place that we need to take some action, and then here are the actions that we're going to take, and then that becomes then those goals and policies later in the draft. So that's this final column here. And this is another thing that is evaluating the barriers and identifying those actions that you'll take to overcome those barriers. That's something that's spelled out in the GMA in those requirements that were added by House Bill 1220. So this is a key part of our compliance with that requirement, that documentation requirement. So moving from there, from the adequate provisions table, the introduction touches on the racially disparate impacts and summarizes that racially disparate impacts evaluation. And then another piece that we haven't really talked about yet is this displacement risk requirement. So one of the things that House Bill 1220 added to the requirements for the housing element is that cities need to identify places that may have an elevated risk of displacement, what sometimes is called gentrification, or getting priced out as development occurs. So we need to identify those places where that risk is present, or there may be an elevated risk, and then we need to identify policies to address that displacement risk, and not necessarily completely eliminate it, but we have to do something to reduce and mitigate the displacement risk. So that's discussed in this section of the introduction. You'll see some maps in here that were pulled from that RDI evaluation, and basically showing, perhaps unsurprisingly, that compared to the four-county area, King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties, Mercer Island has a relatively low displacement risk. But within the city, there are a couple of areas that are mapped out here where there's some displacement risk, because there's older buildings that are probably more affordable, and they're also older multifamily units. And so we just need to identify those areas that may have an elevated risk, and then we have some policies later in the element to address that displacement risk. So then moving from there, you can see the maps of the areas. The final section of the introduction is pointing to or connecting that introductory text with the goals and policies that follow, just kind of spelling out what does all of that mean and how does that filter into the goals and policies. So then we start with, oh, that's a little too far in. Then we start with our overall housing goals and policies. Actually, why don't I pause there if there's any questions on the introduction before I keep rolling. Okay.
Yeah, Adam, for context,
Mm-hmm.
because this AMI issue seems to be a major driver of everything, what is the area median income that's referring to? Do we know?
I haven't committed it to memory. It's tricky because the area median income is partially dependent on the size of your family. So if you have 4 people in a household, your area median income is, no, that's only true for, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I don't remember exactly what the AMI is, but I'll look it up for next time and make sure that I've got that. that number for you.
Okay, thanks.
But I think it's roughly in the $90,000 a year range, roughly. And also the AMI is when we're talking about area, the area of area median income is King County, so it's not city specific. All right. Moving on to the goals and policies. So the first section of goals and policies is our overall housing strategies. So this is the most like general spelling out of the approaches that we'll be taking to address housing in the housing element. So it spells out this first policy here is really just outlining here are the different sections of goals and policies later in the element, and these are the ways that we're going to be accommodating our growth. It kind of starts at this really high level. The second policy here is defining what these different income segments, what high income, moderate income, low, very low, and extremely low income all mean relative to the AMI. And those are segments that are actually spelled out in the RCW in the GMA. So, for example, low income is a household that earns below 80%, so up to 80%, down to 50% of the AMI. And that range for low income, for the phrase low income, is set in the GMA. So we're just echoing that here in 1.2. And I see a hand up at this point.
Yeah, Adam, just a quick question. On 1.3A, I was trying to figure out, is moderate density, is that code for middle housing? Is that what that? I've seen it used otherwise places in the same place, and I was just curious.
Yeah, so the GMA specifically uses that phrase moderate density, that combination of words, and it is more or less townhome, duplex, triplex, middle housing. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
And 1.3, it's a good segue. This policy is really articulating the general approach that we'll take to each of these income segments. And essentially it's saying we're going to do, we don't have to do as much for high income housing, but we're going to do a lot for those lower income households. So that's spelled out in 1.3. And this is a good spot to point out the notation that I talked about on those minimum requirements. So you see at the end of 1.3, there's this bracketed text. That's referring back to Exhibit 3, that housing planning framework. So you can see what minimum requirements policy 1.3 is directed at. So as you're going through the draft and reviewing it this weekend, or when you get a chance, you'll see that notation, and that'll help you kind of refer back to that, and you can see where those different policies came from. Ultimately, when we move forward with the draft, that bracketed text would come out. We're not going to keep those references in. It's just for your reference as you review. So 1.4 is, again, a really high level list of those actions that we're going to take, or the things that we want to ensure are in our neighborhoods or we have access to in our neighborhoods. And this is derived, most of this list is actually derived from countywide planning policy. So we use that as kind of the framework there for 1.4. The next several policies, we have this healthy and safe homes that came from the countywide planning policy in 1.5. And then 1.6 is creating a connection with the climate action plan. We kind of just wanted to point to that's where when it comes to housing, the climate action plan is really outlining our strategy. And then 1.7 and 1.8, those are that's creating some connection to our later racially disparate impacts related goal and policies in under goal 3 that we'll get to, but kind of pointing to that we want everyone to have a place here in Mercer Island. Then 1.9 is directed at specifically that we want to, where we're increasing our housing choices, that those are proximate to employment and high capacity transit. That's another big one, particularly for the Puget Sound Regional Council. We haven't talked a lot about PSRC tonight, but they're a regional transportation planning organization, which is they will review our comprehensive plan to make sure that it's consistent with their regional plan. And particularly for their review for transportation related goals and policies. So the PSRC is another layer of review that we'll have here. Let's see. The next couple of policies just round out this first general approach. 1.10 is pointing to that ADUs primarily will be looking at as addressing our moderate to low income household housing needs. That ADUs are, because of their price point, are probably not going to yield us a ton of like extremely low 0 to 30% AMI housing. And then policies 111 and 112. This is where we created the policy direction around that implementation that we were talking about, increasing the capacity, the housing capacity in town center and the commercial office zones. So 111 and 112 are giving that general direction that we're how we're going to go forth and do that piece of it. And again, the implementing ordinance will come back to the Planning Commission once we're finished with the housing element here. The next goal is one of the bigger pieces of this housing element, and that's goal 2, and it's directed specifically at affordable housing and how we're going to, it's outlining the strategies we're going to take to increase those housing units for households that earn below 80% of the AMI, so those lower income households. The first one here is talking about maintaining that close to high capacity transit. So 2.1 is directed at high capacity transit. 2.2 is directed at addressing those cost barriers. And this is a little bit higher level where it's directing a review of our development standards and finding ways to make it easier to build these units and making it so that so that we have more capacity for those units, with the intent that simplifying or streamlining that permit review process could reduce some of the costs associated with affordable housing development. And then finally looking at some programs and partnerships that we can use to decrease the cost of building those affordable units. 2.3 is looking at decreasing the barriers and promoting access to affordable home ownership. So we didn't want to lose sight of, I think a lot of times when we're talking about affordable housing, we're thinking of rental housing, but 2.3 is directed at that we also want to be thinking about home ownership as well. 2.4 is directed at that moderate density, so like the middle housing, and stating that we're going to use moderate density to increase affordable home ownership for moderate income households, or home ownership opportunities, I should say, for those moderate income households, because that's kind of the that's the best housing type, or that is the housing type that can accommodate those households the best, price wise. 2.5 is looking at it. 2.5 outlines all of the strategies, the incentives that we're going to be looking at for increasing our affordable, our income restricted units. So these are the units that are most likely to serve those households below 50% AMI. So there's a laundry list of those incentives here. And these incentives, this list of incentives actually was one of the things that we spent some time discussing with that the housing work group survey that we talked about. So the housing work group went through and picked out these incentives from a list of things that we could look at doing. So that's what policy 2.5 is outlining, all of those incentives for income restricted housing. One of the other things that came out of the housing work group survey is these policies 2.6 and 2.7. And those came from that housing work group survey, and that's looking at finding ways to close some of those funding gaps. So they direct the city to evaluate those potential revenue sources, and then also take a look at a fee in lieu program. And what a fee in lieu program is a program where you allow developers to, instead of constructing affordable units, they pay a fee instead, and that fee then would go into a local housing fund. So those are some of the mechanisms that we have to help kind of close some of those funding gaps for new affordable units. The 2.8 is also directed at closing some of that. Basically, it's directed at gathering those resources and distributing them to the extent that the city can, to fund new housing development, affordable housing development. And then 2.9 is looking at, this is another one kind of combining with this fee in lieu program. 2.9 would be to evaluate whether the city can or wants to institute some kind of inclusionary zoning, where in exchange for a certain amount of density, developers would be required, or not in exchange, in certain zones, developers would be required to provide a certain amount of affordable housing in those new, like, multifamily developments. We would need to, in order to do that, we would need to do an evaluation of of quite a few different things to figure out whether that was possible. But that pairs really well with a fee in lieu program, because then developers then basically have a choice of whether they want to pay the fee or develop the units. So we combined that in. That was another one that came from that the housing work group survey. 2.10 and 2.11 are directed at a regional coalition for housing, or ARCH. They're our regional partner that we work with. We're a member city within ARCH, and they manage a lot of our affordable units on the island here that we have already, and they're a really great resource regionally for providing affordable housing. And regional coordination is kind of one of the things, particularly the countywide planning policies are really directed at, is creating more regional response to this significant housing needs throughout the county. So that's where 212 and 213 are also about creating partnerships and meeting with those folks that may know what we need to do in order to produce more or not produce more, but set the stage for more permanent supportive housing development or extremely low income housing development. So these last two policies under goal 2 are really directed at those partnerships and finding new ways to amend the code to make that a more likely thing to get developed.
Zach, before you move on to the RDI issue, is there any material that you've looked at regarding the fee in lieu program? And are there any in existence now or you know, it's being started up? And what does that, is there any sense as to what that really looks like? And then finally, last question would be, following on Mayor Nice's issue or comments, how does the city get credit for having essentially built a low-income unit or whatever in such a program? Has any of that stuff been looked at this point?
Yeah, so a fee in lieu program, I can't think of a specific jurisdiction off the top of my head that's instituted one of those, but it's a relatively common approach to funding these kinds of projects. Typically, with that, you have to use the money from that fee in lieu program to then fund projects within your jurisdiction. So it's not like with a fee in lieu program, we wouldn't necessarily be able to take that money and then build the affordable units in South Seattle or something. Like we have to build them here. So in theory, that would be how the city would then get, credit for those units, is that they'd have to be built here eventually. So, I mean, that's all part of the evaluation process too, because you have to also know what are you charging for that fee in lieu, right? Like how much is an affordable unit worth and those kinds of things. So it would be a bigger project, like on a 3 to 4 year time frame instead of a next year kind of thing.
Chris.
Yeah, I guess, I'm looking at the incentives for affordable housing. There's, bear with me just a sec. There's a point where we've talked to the comprehensive plan about trying to encourage green building materials. And, it occurs to me if we did something that required more green building materials, one incentive for affordable housing could be relief from those requirements, in that context. And I guess I'm thinking that maybe that's a design standards issue and it's kind of premature here, but I just wanted to raise it in case there was something to be done in the context of the housing element that would, sort of leave that open as a possibility.
Yeah, there might be. So it's a really interesting idea, like that is the carrot and stick, or a potential carrot and stick that doesn't exist now. So we could, in theory, if you wanted to take a look at this 2.5 might be a place where you could include that. I might say it would be useful, I think, to generalize a little bit more. So maybe it's
relief from other design requirements or something like that.
Yeah, something along those lines, because then we can kind of, as we as we undertake those other kinds of requirements, like if we're amending our design code, we could think about building in that incentive, like as we'd have the policy direction to do that. A lot of times with this, I mean, we've talked about this with other elements, like finding that right elevation is always kind of tricky because we want to like have it be specific enough that we know what we're talking about, but loose enough to where we can implement it as needed at the time being. So that would be.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, there's a lot to digest under goal 2. If you could only read one set of policies, that's probably the spot to do it if you're time constrained, because that's really like the meat of this element. I mean, there's a lot of important stuff in the rest of this, but goal 2 and its attendant policies are really the heavy part of the element here. This next section under goal 3 is no less important. It's the section directed at the racially disparate impacts. So this is a new requirement under House Bill 1220. We have to, the requirements are that the city both evaluate the existing policies for potential racially disparate impacts and then adopt specific policies to begin undoing those impacts that you've identified. That you can see the full evaluation in that the RDI evaluation, which again, that was with Agenda Bill 6385. If you want to dig into, there's 32 exhibits with tables and maps. There's a lot of information in there. But what we essentially found in that RDI evaluation is that the impacts identified were really that there was a lack of affordable units, and that was falling disproportionately on our BIPOC population, and that there was just an increased level of cost burden there. So these policies are directed at undoing some of that, and then also creating a system kind of moving forward that we can avoid having disparate impacts in the future. So you'll see, this policy 3.1 is directed to that first impact that I talked about, where there was increased displacement risk and a higher cost burden. And then these last 3 policies, 3.3, 3.4, and 3.5, are directed at that future piece of it, of finding ways to avoid establishing policies in the future that may create those impacts. And so 3.3 is looking at creating partnerships to find ways to promote those outcomes, those more equitable outcomes. 3.4 is a requirement for all of our future public participation plans that we adopt adopt 4 actions to implement this element. We need to include some kind of statement about how that public participation plan will be directed at reaching those impacted communities. And then finally, but seeking those more partnerships and dedicating resources to eliminate those disparities to access in housing. I see another Chris, Commissioner
Same
Hill.
hand.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, real quick question. When it talks about undoing identified racially disparate impacts, is the focus of the requirement only on the impacts caused by the current regulatory regime? We're not trying to undo the impacts of redlining and the history of discrimination on Mercer Island, just on what we're dealing with now. Is that right, or does it go back further than that? I was a little confused about that basic question.
Yeah, so the way that the GMA requirement, the 1220 requirement is, it doesn't specify a time horizon. The intent, so those other things that happened 50, 60, 80 years ago are kind of fall under this umbrella. There's only so much we as a local jurisdiction can do to undo some of those. And that, I think that's why the 1220 requirement, this racially disparate, is that we need to take things to begin to undo those impacts. So these steps here of creating those partnerships, ensuring that our public participation plans have those like components to it, should help begin to undo those things that were identified in the RDI evaluation. But to answer your first question, there wasn't a specified time horizon for that evaluation.
And it seems as though the focus, as I looked at the RDI evaluation, didn't go back. You know, even though the bill didn't specify, it seems like the focus was more contemporary than going back to, you know, some of the horrific practices of the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah. So the data analysis in the RDI evaluation was a little bit more focused on today. Mercer Island is fortunate in that it didn't incorporate it until the middle 60s, and so it maybe dodged some of the worst things that happened before that. But the focus was more on what we could do today. Yes. All right, moving to goal 4. So as I mentioned, as we were looking through the introduction, one of the new requirements was to address displacement and establish anti-displacement policies. So policies to help control and reduce the displacement risk that may occur as development occurs or as the zoning regulations change. So goal 4 is really directed at that. So the first policy here, 4.1, actually came from, this is another one that was derived from the Housing Work Group survey, where, and that's a direction to create an inventory of our naturally occurring affordable housing and our other affordable housing units, because we don't actually currently have that good of a inventory of those types of housing units. We know we have a pretty good idea of where the like income restricted permanently affordable units are, but some of those other affordable housing types don't exist. And so first we want to kind of identify where those units might be. The next policy is taking a look at some of the tenant protections that are available and evaluating those. So these are tenant protections are things that help tenants stay in units as the building might sell or as rent goes up. So one of the current tenant protections that we actually currently have in our code, and we could look at expanding, is this oh, sorry, actually that's a different policy. But the tenant protections listed here are an advance notice of a rent increase, relocation assistance when that would be when an apartment building sells and converts to condos or is redeveloped for a different development, and then also the right of first refusal. So that would give tenants the option of purchasing the unit when it converts to like condominiums or if it's going to be sold. And then 4.3 is really requiring that as we look at changing in zoning, that we need to evaluate what that might do to the displacement risk. So 4.3 is directing that study, requiring that we that we do that analysis and what we need to look at when evaluating that displacement risk. And then finally, 4.4 is just tying back in this evaluation from 4.3. 4.4 is saying that whenever we are making a policy or regulatory amendment, that we need to make some kind of findings that that displacement risk has been reduced and or mitigated. So this is just a requirement that again, it doesn't say we have to find that it was eliminated, but we have to find that we took some kind of action to reduce or mitigate displacement risk. The next section of goals and policies, goal 5 is looking at our regulations. So most of our regulatory policies are going to be found in the land use element. But we had a couple of strategies that specifically talked about streamlining the permitting process for housing units. And so we wanted to tie that together here under goal 5. The first policy here is to take a look at specifically our multifamily development standards to find potential amendments to make it easier to permit the multifamily development and streamline some of the review. Our multifamily development standards currently could probably use an update, and so this is giving us some direction on how to do that update. And then 5.2 is directed at that moderate density again, or like middle housing. Specifically, duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes are called out in 5.2. And that comes from directly from the GMA requirement for moderate density housing. So when you see those 3 in 5.2, that's where that came from. Then 5.3 is directed at anticipating our work on middle housing that will come up next year when we're implementing House Bill 1110 that requires a certain things for middle housing. So 5.3 is basically just saying that we're going to comply with the state law. And then the last 2 under the residential regulations here, 5.4 and 5.5, are directed at ADUs and talk about the tailoring those ADU development standards to possibly find some ways to increase the number of ADUs that are available for some of our affordable housing needs. So that's 5.4 and 5.5. This is also another one where House Bill 1337, which we'll be implementing next year, requires some things here. So 5.4 is directed at that. The final section here is goal 6. These are our implementation goal and strategies, or goal and policies. So you'll see this is basically outlining a process by which we will implement the element. So every 2 years, we will put together an implementation strategy that outlines what we'll be doing from this element. And we'll be providing that a report at the same time to the city council about how implementation has been going. And then one of the pieces here that's unique to this process is 6.3. This talks about an implementation progress report at the 5-year mark after this periodic review. And that's actually a new requirement that was also added by House Bill 1220. The state and county will be involved with a 5-year check-in, basically to see how we're doing in accomplishing our housing element goals and policies. And then the final policy here is talking about how we will provide those resources for and respond to our limited resources for implementation of the element. So these last 4 policies here are really outlining our process for making this not just a bunch of words on a page, but actually like something that happens in the real world. So that concludes my walkthrough of the element. Are there any questions at this point?
Angie,
Not a question as much as maybe a comment or a flag for my commissioner friends. Chris, when you asked the question about incentives, and talked about, the idea of potentially waiving certain green building incentives. What struck me and what I think I connected the dots around was sometimes we have design standards and things in place to help improve the overall quality of our new products, housing, buildings, whatnot. In the last 5 years, I've been approached by 3 different low-income residents occupying TOD facilities in places I won't announce here, but they've had great concerns about the quality of the living situation that they're in, whether it was the materials that were used that were potentially contributing to making some of the residents sick. And it just dawns on me that when we try and make those trade-offs, sometimes we open the door to creating an environment for people that's just not healthy or not good, or it results in an outcome that we didn't intend, but it makes it a lot easier in our current system to promote. And so I think I want to ask us, like, and in some ways that's an unintended racial or economic impact to lower income people when we remove the higher standard and allow lower standards to be applied to where they live. And so I think that's something I just want to flag for us now and in the future as we think through when we implement those kinds of strategies to ensure that people of all strata can live in a healthy environment and that we find a way to impact elsewhere.
That is a good point. Having lived on busy roads or like near environmental hazards, like I've had that experience before. Yeah. Let's see. So let me share. Let me share my screen. I'll give you a quick walkthrough. So next up, just quickly, I'll touch on land use, the land use consistency amendments, just so you can see kind of where we're where these are, what these look like here. So as I mentioned, these green highlighted policies are the substantive amendments. These 3 policies and 2 goals are the substantive amendments. And you can see the track changes, the strikeout underline here. Again, this is tracking the change from the previous Planning Commission draft and not from the existing adopted land use element. And for the most part, these are streamlining the goals and policies that are highlighted here. 15.5 is a new policy that wasn't either in the Planning Commission draft or in the adopted draft of the land use element. And 15.5 is getting at some of the ideas that were taken out of these other policies. It's kind of reformulated into 15.5. So you can see kind of where that came from here. Then moving on, just again to touch on this real quick, the blue highlighting these are more or less a complete change to the implementation policies from the land use element. But they're primarily just to make it match those implementation policies from the housing element. So you'll see these are pretty much the same, almost verbatim from one to the other, just to have a consistent process across elements here. And then finally, you'll see the simple text amendments here highlighted in yellow. These are more or less, they don't necessarily change the policy direction. They're just some minor changes to the wording to make it more consistent with how we've written the other policies in the housing element, and make sure that they're consistent throughout. So that's the land use element amendments. Then let me just share one more thing with you. And then I think we'll be wrapping up here. So I just wanted to touch on the schedule moving forward. We are on a bit of a tight timeline here. So you have the draft now. We're asking for comments by this Monday, March 25th. Comments on this first draft. And then next Thursday or next Wednesday, when we meet on the 27th, we can look through those, review those comments on this first draft and start refining the draft. And all of this is working towards concluding our review on April 10th. So we can, if there's something else that comes out, we can make sure that we get it finished by April 10th. And this is so that we can have a draft together and ready to go when we have the community workshop that we're planning in May. So we need to kind of get all of this wrapped up so that we can stay on schedule with the kind of overarching project moving forward. So that is our upcoming schedule. Now I will turn it over for any other questions.
Carolyn.
Yeah, Adam, is it possible for you to give us documents that are really easy to edit or put comments in? I've got kind of spoiled there on the housing work group with those ways of commenting so easily.
Yeah, I can provide you with a Word document. So when we were with the work group, where I sent you the link and you could edit the document that way. Because of the structure of the Planning Commission and the Open Public Meetings Act, we can't really do that here. But I can give you a Word document that you could edit on your own.
Okay, well, one thing I want to ask, I think sometimes when I've had a Word document, if it still has the lines numbered,
Mhm.
with it, I'm not quite sure I can that actually works. Does it work? I mean, maybe I'm just thinking of making a Word document and then having all those numbers on the left. You can't copy and paste anything. I'm not.
Okay, yeah, sometimes that can be tricky, or with a PDF too, line numbers can kind of make it funky.
That's maybe what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, tomorrow I'll send you a Word document tomorrow.
Okay.
And I'll try to simplify the format of the document too.
So this will be the kind where you can put in your strikeouts and underline, but you can also make a comment in the margin explaining something. Okay.
And it'll be just your copy, not the group's copy that everybody's working from. And yeah.
Oh, I see. So just your own copy. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
That'll work.
All right. Any other questions for me? This concludes. I'm finished with my spiel tonight. So.
Okay. Thank you, Evan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Carolyn, I assume that's an old hand.
Yeah, that is an old hand. I'm done asking my question. Yeah.
Okay. So if anyone else wants the Word versions, just let Adam know and he can send those to others as well. With that, I think it's time to move on to other business. Allison, I believe you have a report.
Yeah, I'll just keep it very brief tonight. Adam just flashed up on there the schedule for the next few meetings. So we'll be back next week to go through comments. And then we've got the 2 meetings in April, the 10th and the 17th. And we're going to keep chugging along with this element. We'll be bringing back some of the cleanup items for the land use element related to climate that we talked about the last meeting. And then we're aiming for May 1st is the open house, the comprehensive plan update open house with the community. So we're starting to plan for that as well. I believe you've all received a calendar invite for it. So just make sure and save that date. And we'll be coming back to you when we get a little closer to that event with some information about kind of the structure and the activities that will be available for the public to engage in there. And that's all I've got.
Okay. Planned absences for future meetings. Hearing none, we get to go home early. The next regular meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, as Allison said, the 27th at 6 p.m. There being no other business to come before the Planning Commission, the time is now 7:35 p.m. and the meeting is adjourned. As a reminder to commissioners, please stay online until city staff has terminated the broadcast. Good evening and thank you for joining us.